In June of 1917, Siegfried Sassoon, the British soldier-poet, was in the south of England, recovering from a bullet wound.
Aunt Evelyn's Delphinium spires were blue against the distant blue of the sky, and the shadows of Irish yews were lengthening across the lawn. Out in France, the convoys of wounded and gassed were being carried into the field hospitals. And up in the line, the slaughter went on because no one knew how to stop it. Men are beginning to ask for what they're fighting, Dottrell had written in his last letter. Could I be blamed for being one of those at home who are asking the same question?
This program was made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Funding for this program was also provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
In 1916, the only major sea engagement of the First World War, the Battle of Jutland, was fought to a draw. That same year, the British Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, was lost at sea. 85-year-old Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, died. The Russian monk Rasputin was murdered by members of the Tsar's own family. 1917 began with bleak prospects for the Allies. In the east, the Russian army was nearly a spent force. In the west, massive bloodletting had taken its toll on the French and British armies. Then there was the onslaught of a bitter winter. For many, the limits of endurance had been reached.
January 4th, 1917. My own dear mother. Since I set foot on Calais Quays, I have not had dry feet. We were let down gently into the real thing, mud. It has penetrated now into that sanctuary, my sleeping bag, and that holy of holies, my pajamas. I chose a servant for myself yesterday, not for his profile, nor yet his clean hands, but for his excellence in bayonet work. I censored hundreds of letters yesterday, and the hope of peace was in every one.
Wilfred Owen was a young poet just finding his voice when war broke out. He marched off to battle with a romantic view of war common among the young.
Oh, meet it is, and passing sweet, to live in peace with others, but sweeter still and far more meet to die in war for brothers.
The English officer class came into the war as innocents. It was a frightful shock to them to discover that the sort of their imagination of war, which had been fed by the classical literature of war, was incorrect. The war wasn't brave and heroic. It was pretty horrible and nasty and dirty, and you were more concerned about keeping dry and keeping warm than you were about closing with the enemy.
Owen was commissioned a second lieutenant and sent to join the 2nd Manchester Regiment on the Somme. He entered the trenches in the middle of the worst winter in memory.
My own dear mother. I can see no excuse for deceiving you about these last 4 days. I have not been at the front. I have been in front of it. I held an advanced post in the middle of no man's land. The Germans knew we were staying there and decided we shouldn't. Those 50 hours were the agony of my happy life. I nearly broke down and let myself drown in the water that was slowly rising over my knees. I suppose I can endure cold and fatigue and the face-to-face death as well as another. But extra for me, there is the universal pervasion of ugliness. The distortion of the dead, whose unburyable bodies sit outside the dugouts. In poetry we call them glorious, but to sit with them all day, all night, and a week later to come back and find them still sitting there in motionless groups, that is what saps the soldierly spirit.
Many of the soldiers had to cope with images that wouldn't go away. Many of these parts of human bodies were actually used to shore up the trench system itself. Some soldiers found it humorous to hang their water canteens on a protruding arm or a protruding leg. These were not people who were disrespectful of the dead. They were living with the dead. One can imagine the possibilities of becoming numb to such images, but those who couldn't turn off their feelings, internalized them, brought them home with them, lived with them, dreamt about them, and went mad because of them.
While Wilfred Owen was sleeping, a shell hit his trench, blasting him into the air and killing a fellow officer. Owen spent days trapped near the dismembered body. When finally relieved, he was found to be confused, trembling, and behaving strangely.
My very dear sister, you must not entertain the least concern about me. You know, it was not the Germans that worked me up, nor the explosives, but it was living so long by poor old Cock Robin, as we used to call Second Lieutenant Kroger, who lay not only nearby, but in various places around and about, if you understand.
Owen was diagnosed as having shell shock and sent home. He had lasted only 4 months. Shell shock represented a kind of mutiny, a personal withdrawal from an intolerable reality. Not all, or even most soldiers, suffered from shell shock. But those who did were sobering examples of what mechanized warfare could do to human beings.
Rifleman Arthur Russell was, or had been, a magnificent specimen of manhood, 6 feet tall. There was not a mark on him, yet he was helpless as a child. When I returned about a month later, I found Russell trying to walk. His speech was slowly returning, a slow, halting speech full of stammers. But I doubt if he ever again became a fully fit man.
The symptoms were often tied to an event on the battlefield. The soldier who bayoneted an enemy in the face developed a facial tic. this man responded to nothing, except the word bomb, which sent him scurrying under the bed. This French soldier became hysterical at the sight of an officer's red hat. Treatment for most enlisted men involved rest and recuperation.
There's some extraordinary material about the way in which soldiers who were incapable of acting were taught first to sew, then to weave, then to farm, then to carry a gun, and then to shoot it again. As if they're moving from a kind of feminine recuperation to masculine combat status, and that they can go back to the men's war.
The worst cases left doctors grasping for solutions. Electric shock treatment was applied to thousands. Some improved. For the rest, the pain of treatment only added to their misery. But this was not the only experimental method of treating shell shock. Far from the Western Front, in a place where the grass was still green and trees still had leaves, doctors developed an innovative method of treating shell shock. The patients were officers like Wilfred Owen.
My own dear mother. We left Netley on Monday morning. I woke up as we were rounding the coast by Dunbar. The castle looked more than ever a hallucination with the morning sun behind it. A taxi brought me up here about 2.5 miles from the town. There is nothing very attractive about the place. It is far too full of officers, some of whom I know.
Owen's journey took him here, to the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland, to a place called Craiglockhart. In this former sanitarium, doctors attempted the emotional repair of British officers using a technique only recently pioneered by Freud, psychotherapy. Others called it the talking cure. For Owen, it began to gradually take effect.
My dearest mother, last night I had a consultation with Dr. Brock from 11 till midnight. I still have disastrous dreams, but they are taking on a more civilian character. Motor accidents and so on. Nothing more to tell, I think. Ever your own, Wilfred.
It was here that Owen first read a book of verse by one of Britain's most controversial soldiers, Siegfried Sassoon.
I have just been reading Siegfried Sassoon and am feeling at a very high pitch of emotion. Nothing like his trench life sketches has ever been written or ever will be written. Shakespeare reads vapid after these.
It's bad to think of war, when thoughts you gagged all day come back to scare you. And it's been proved that soldiers don't go mad unless they've lost control of ugly thoughts that drive them out to jabber among the trees. They'll soon forget their haunted nights, their dreams that drip with murder, and they'll be proud of glorious war that shattered all their pride.
Siegfried Sassoon survived some of the fiercest fighting on the Western Front. His actions at the Somme had earned him the Military Cross for gallantry and the nickname Mad Jack.
While I was running, I pulled the safety pin out of a Mills bomb. My right hand being loaded, I did the same for the left. Just before I arrived at the top, I threw my 2 bombs. Quite unexpectedly, I found myself looking down into a trench with a great many Germans in it. Fortunately for me, they were already retreating. It had not occurred to them that they were being attacked by a single fool.
Mad Jack had many close encounters with death at the front. But the war hit hardest when his younger brother was killed at Gallipoli, a loss which devastated his family. Sassoon's friend, Robert Graves, witnessed the depth of this grief when he visited the Sassoon home while the 2 men were on leave together. Graves later recounted in his war novel, Goodbye to All That, what it was like to stay in the dead brother's room.
The mother kept the bedroom exactly as he had left it, with the sheets aired, the linen always freshly laundered, flowers and cigarettes by the bedside.
The Sassoons were not alone in their grief. Mourners throughout Europe were finding it hard to let go of the dead. Many began turning to the occult.
The first night I spent there, Sassoon and I sat up talking about the war until after 12 o'clock. The talk had excited me, and though I managed to fall asleep an hour later, I was continually wakened by sudden rapping noises, which I tried to disregard, but which grew louder and louder. They seemed to come from everywhere. Soon, sleep left me, and I lay in a cold sweat. At nearly 3 o'clock, I heard a diabolic yell and a succession of laughing, sobbing shrieks that sent me flying to the door. In the passage, I collided with the mother, who, to my surprise, was fully dressed. "It's nothing," she said. "I'm so sorry you've been disturbed." There were thousands of mothers like her, getting in touch with their dead sons by various spiritualistic means. In the morning, I told my friend, "I'm leaving this place. It's worse than France."
Both Sassoon and Graves returned to the front. In April of 1917, Sassoon took a sniper's bullet through the shoulder while leading an attack. Even after his physical wound had begun to heal, it was apparent that Sassoon was still not well. As with his mother, the dead were visiting him at night.
When the lights are out, and the ward is half shadow and half glowing firelight, then the horrors come creeping across the floor. A livid, grinning face with bristly mustache peers at me over the edge of my bed, the hands clutching at my sheets. There is a hole in his jaw, and the blood spreads across his face like the ink spilt on blotting paper. I wish I could sleep.
These were the images, the fantastic, monstrous images that haunted their dreams. These are people who were victims of an appalling kind of war, but we must never forget that they were also executioners. They had killed, they had maimed, they had been responsible for the mutilation of men on the other side of the line. How to cope with that responsibility is something very hard for anyone to imagine. We mustn't judge them for this. Many of them were under the age of 25. This was their baptism of fire in a moral sense.
Sassoon's moral baptism convinced him to take a stand against the war. As brave as any action he had taken in combat, he sent a letter to his commanding officer and made it public.
I believe that this war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolonging those sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust.
The army had a problem. What to do with a clearly decorated, brave, honorable man who reached a conclusion that the war was dishonorable? What will they do with him? The answer was very subtle. It was to claim that anyone who found that the war was mad must be mad himself.
Instead of being court-martialed, Sassoon was quietly shipped off to Craiglockhart. Here he met Wilfred Owen. The two men became friends and spent hours discussing each other's work. Between them, they produced some of the most important war literature of the 20th century.
I am banished from the patient men who fight. They smote my heart to pity, built my pride. Shoulder to aching shoulder, side by side, they trudged away from life's broad wheels of light. Their wrongs were mine, and ever in my sight they went arrayed in honor. But they died, not one by one, and mutinous I cried to those who sent them out into the night.
At the end of his stay at Craiglockhart, Siegfried Sassoon ended his mutiny. He decided to return to the front, not for the sake of his country, but for the men he had left behind.
Love drove me to rebel, love drives me back to grope with them through hell. And in their tortured eyes, I stand forgiven.
Wilfred Owen was also well enough for his war to go on. He left Craiglockhart on November 3rd, 1917. He had exactly 1 year and 1 day to live. Mutiny wore many faces in 1917. In France, one belonged to a general who pushed too hard. Another to a corporal who had suffered too much.
What a sorry scene. 7 straight days of insomnia, fatigue, thirst, and sheer agony have transformed these healthy young men, these proud, disciplined companies, into a ragged band of laggards.
Corporal Louis Bartas was among the survivors of the meat grinder called Verdun. A spectacular grumbler, he saw himself as fighting 2 wars, one against Germany, the other against his own officers and their petty commands.
Louis Bartas wrote a diary during the war, and it's an extraordinary testimony about a certain sort of soldier, absolutely against the war, pacifist, who tried to maintain at least some parcel of humanity in the brutality of the war.
Bartas cared little for promotions. His interest was in staying alive. That was no easy task, as he also fought at the second great battle of 1916, the Somme.
In one night, more cannon shells were fired than in one of Napoleon's campaigns. These men, exhausted, poorly fed, stuck in the muddy trenches, took the order to attack with murmurs. Not everybody can be a hero.
One would-be hero was Robert Nivelle, the new commander of the French forces. Dashing, self-assured, and vain, Nivelle promised new tactics to break out of the trenches and win the war.
Our method has been tried out. I can assure you that victory is certain.
What is astonishing is that he succeeded in convincing politicians and generals alike. It's very strange now to think about that, but there was an optimism at the end of 1916, beginning of 17, about the ability, the French army's ability to break through.
To guarantee his victory, Nivelle embarked on a massive buildup of arms and materiel.
I insist that the stamp of violence, of brutality and of rapidity must characterize the offensive. The greater their numbers, the greater my victory. We will win it all within 24 to 48 hours.
Many were caught up in Nivelle's bravado, but not Louis Barthas.
We had read to us an order from the great executioner, General Nivelle, saying among other absurdities that the hour of sacrifice has arrived. No one was enthused by this lecture of patriotic gibberish.
Adieu la vie, adieu l'amour, adieu toutes les femmes. C'est bien fini, c'est pour toujours de cette guerre infâme. C'est à Grasse, sur le plateau, on se fait trouer la peau. On est tous condamnés, on est des sacrifiés.
On April 16th, Nivelle's forces massed on the fields of Chemin-des-Dames, where the ladies of the court of Louis XIV had once promenaded. Here were gathered 700,000 French soldiers, and on the ridge above them, 600,000 Germans. As morning broke, the French soldiers went over the top, hoping that this would be the decisive battle of the war. The plan called for advancing 6 miles. By sundown, the troops had moved only 600 yards. Ignoring his promise to stop the offensive if not successful within 2 days, Nivelle pushed ahead for 10. 200,000 men were killed or wounded, and still no breakthrough.
After a few hours, after the beginning of the offensive, soldiers considered that the offensive was a failure. It was perfectly clear to them that it was a failure.
By now, the war had claimed 1.5 million French soldiers, the equivalent of 1 casualty for every minute of the war. The survivors had reached the breaking point. Soldiers going back into the lines began buying like sheep being led to slaughter. Then, 2 weeks after the offensive, the only full-scale mutiny on the Western Front broke out. At first, groups of men, then entire units, refused to re-enter the trenches.
There would be very emotional scenes between the officers and the spokesman of the men. I don't mean grand opera, I mean that there was a very great depth of emotion on both sides because, well, you can imagine the officers, every officer's worst nightmare is that his men won't obey him.
One soldier caught up in this officer's nightmare was the naturally rebellious Louis Bartas.
Our captain arrived on the scene with a police escort. He tried to speak, but his first words were drowned out by the crowd. Seething with rage, but powerless, he ordered a roll call. A crowd of several hundred soldiers crowded around and mocked these orders. For an hour they hurled abuse at him. Several shots were fired into the air.
More units began refusing to return to the front lines. In Bartas's regiment, there was talk of replacing their officers.
To my amazement, they offered me as a replacement for the colonel. Imagine me, an obscure peasant, commander of the 296th Regiment. I refused, since I had no wish to be tied to an execution post.
Word of the mutiny quickly spread to Paris. There, women working in the armaments industry joined the soldiers on strike. They demanded better treatment for themselves and for their husbands and brothers at the front.
The soldiers who mutinied were mutinying not so much to end the war as to demand that the war be conducted differently. These soldiers were looking to the state and saying, we are citizens. You cannot simply hurl us at machine guns and blow us up. We're citizens of a republic. We have rights. I think something very similar was going on with these women munition workers. They link their own conditions in the factory with what they perceive to be an unfair burden of sacrifice on their own husbands and brothers.
The unrest in Paris only heightened the fear about the mutiny at the front. If the men refused to fight, the Germans would overrun the country and win the war. Fortunately for France, it was not that kind of mutiny.
It was a sort of oddly peaceful strike, given that the soldiers all had weapons, so they could have turned them on their officers. They didn't. They sort of politely said, we've had enough. The war's gone on too long, too many of us have been killed, we never get anywhere. We don't want to attack any longer. We'll defend the country, but we won't attack.
Half of the French army took part in the mutiny, but the Germans never found out. The best-kept secret of the war.
They don't try to fraternize with the enemy. They try to explain. It's a sort of general strike. They try to negotiate a new balance of power between them and officers, between what they want and what is expected from them. In a way, these soldiers are not soldiers, they are citizens.
The mutinies by France's citizen soldiers worked. Nivelle was replaced by Philippe Pétain, who immediately improved leave arrangements and living conditions. Even more important, Pétain ordered a stop to the pointless assaults against the German lines. We will wait, he told his generals, for tanks and the Americans, who had just declared war against Germany. But Pétain also dealt out punishment to the mutineers. Hundreds were given prison sentences. 49 of the ringleaders were shot. Back home in Paris, women factory workers won shorter hours and better working conditions. The would-be hero, Robert Nivelle, never accepted responsibility for his failure and faded into obscurity. Corporal Louis Bartas managed to escape punishment entirely and eventually succeeded in his fondest ambition. He survived the war. Of all the mutinies against war in 1917, the largest was in Russia, where not only an army, but an entire nation rebelled. The Russian army began the war as the world's largest, but it was ill-equipped and incompetently led. Half of its army would be wounded, killed, or never heard from again. "This is not war," said one officer. "This is slaughter."
The winter was severe, and life in the trenches unbearable. Death was a welcome visitor. There were many cases of men snowed under and frozen to death. But we were patient, like true children of Mother Russia.
Maria Bashkareva, known as Yashka, was the most unusual of soldiers. Desperate to escape an abusive husband and deeply patriotic, she petitioned the Tsar to join the army.
Do you know what war is? I asked myself. It's no woman's job. Are you strong enough in body to shed blood and endure the privations? And I found strength enough in me to answer yes.
To know Yashka, one writer said, is to know Russia. By 1917, Yashka, like many Russian soldiers, was struggling with questions about the war.
How long shall we continue this fighting? And what are we fighting for was on the lips of everybody. It was the third winter, and there was no end in sight.
It was also a winter of discontent for the people of Petrograd, Russia's capital. The grim mood was fueled by freezing homes and hungry stomachs, and a lack of faith in the Russian government. Tsar Nicholas II had chosen not to rule in Petrograd, but to be with his troops at the front.
The Tsar's decision to take over the command of the army was a fatal one, because from this point on he would be blamed personally for the losses at the front. And nearly all of the government warned him not to.
The Tsar was also being blamed for the suffering at home. A shortage of bread was moving the women of Petrograd toward revolt.
Politics is one part of it, and the pressures of daily life are another part. And the stresses of having to stand in bread lines for hours and hours and hours when it's freezing cold. The winter of 1917 was the cruelest, coldest winter on record. Pressures of exhaustion, war weariness, a sense that the burdens of the war were coming down unduly heavily on them, and that things just could not continue this way.
March 8th was International Women's Day. The day began with a traditional parade. But as the women marched through the city, their parade turned into an angry demonstration. Men rushed from the factories to join them. Together, they occupied the center of the city for 3 straight days. "We are only asking for bread," they shouted, "and an end to the war."
The chief of the military district could not cope with the situation. But then, on the 26th of February, he effectively turned what was a chaotic bread riot into a revolution by ordering his troops to fire on the unarmed crowds.
Ordered to fire on civilians, soldiers instead shot their officers and joined the rioters. Soon the leading figures of the Tsar's government were running for their lives.
Caps are thrown into the air. Everywhere there are automobiles and crowds. The arsenal has been taken. They say that about 20,000 automatic pistols alone have been handed out. There is a lot of firing on the streets, but it all seems to be for show.
Sergei Dmitrovich Mstislavsky was one of the first to revolt. Although a commissioned officer of the Russian army, Mstislavsky had long dreamed of overthrowing the Tsar. But like other would-be revolutionaries, he was taken by complete surprise when the moment came.
The revolution found us, like the foolish virgins in the gospel, fast asleep.
Leaderless, the revolt took on a life of its own. Police stations were torched by roaming crowds. Prisons were stormed, their inmates released. The socialists, seizing the opportunity, hastily organized in the midst of chaos. Mstislavsky was charged with defending the city against the threat of loyal Tsarist troops.
Our machine guns have been hoisted on the palace roof, but it's all for show since they still don't work. A huge crowd is reportedly gathering in front of the government alcohol warehouse. If they break in, the revolution will drown in a sea of vodka. Those who receive orders do not fulfill them. Those who act without orders. And after all, could it have been otherwise during a revolution?
Orders issued from the front were even more pointless. Unable to stop the revolution by decree, the Tsar boarded his imperial train to return to Petrograd. It was stopped by revolutionary units of his own army. There, his generals convinced him, for the sake of Russia, to abdicate.
The miracle had happened. Tsarism, which enslaved us and thrived on the blood and marrow of the toiler, had fallen. There were tears of joy, embraces, dancing. It all seemed a dream, a wonderful dream.
Everyone was amazed at the suddenness of the revolt. The slowest people on earth, one man said, had done the quickest thing in history. Emblems of the 300-year-old monarchy were torn down. Socialist democracy was proclaimed on Russian soil. Euphoria reigned on the streets.
Dare I confess it, I envied all of them to the point of pain. All those happy people with shining, crystal-clear gazes who so sincerely believed it was all over. As I was listening to another succession of orators, barking the same sounds about liberty from the podium, suddenly the clear, quiet and hard words of my wife came to my mind. Over? Oh no, it can't be over. Not enough blood has been shed.
The man who launched the Second Russian Revolution was not there to witness the first. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik wing of the socialist movement, had been in exile in Switzerland. To him, the fall of Tsarist Russia was just one step in the creation of a new world order. He telegrammed his instructions to his followers in Petrograd. Our tactics, complete mistrust, no support for the new government. We especially distrust Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky, a combative lawyer, was the leading figure of the fragile democracy Lenin was determined to destroy.
Kerensky was a young man in 1917, 35. He was a great orator. He was the darling of the Petrograd intelligentsia. And he saw himself as a man destined to lead Russia out of chaos to freedom.
Kerensky believed his best hope for survival rested with the army. If he could win a major battle at the front, he could drive the Germans to the peace table and his political enemies, like Lenin, from the streets. But by now the army had deteriorated to little more than debating societies. In desperation, Kerensky resorted to a symbolic gesture. He would use Russia's women to shame the men into fighting. A special unit was created, the Women's Battalion of Death. Its leader, Yashka.
There were nearly 2,000 signed pledges. I marched the recruits to 4 barber shops, where barbers closely cropped one girl's head after another. Giggling was strictly forbidden. As soon as one of them disobeyed an order, I quickly removed her uniform and let her go.
Under Yashka's strict discipline, the ranks quickly dwindled from 2,000 peasant women to a loyal remnant of 300. In June, her soldiers were sent to the front to take part in Kerensky's gamble. At first, the Russian offensive was a success. But when the Germans counterattacked, the Russian army crumbled. To stem the retreat, Yashka's battalion was thrown into the battle.
The colonel gave the signal, but the men on my right and to the left would not move. We decided to advance in order to shame the men. Some of my girls were killed outright. Many were wounded.
The morale of the army collapsed, desertions speeded up, soldiers fraternized with the enemy. Trains going back from the front were full of soldiers joyriding their way home. The government at this point had no authority left. The military command had no authority left.
Kerensky had rolled the dice and lost. The crowds who had once cheered him were now cheering Lenin's message of bread, peace, and land.
What we have to appreciate is that the longer the war went on, the more and more the simplicity of the message of the Bolsheviks, bread, peace, and land, the more attractive it became. And what the Bolsheviks did was simply wait. Lenin liked to say that power fell into his hand the way in which a ripe fruit falls off a tree.
In late October, the Bolsheviks were ready to act. The plan included capturing the Winter Palace. Here Kerensky and other members of his provisional government made their last stand, defended by a handful of soldiers and members of the Women's Battalion. Sergei Mstislavsky helped plan the Bolshevik takeover.
The palace had then been cordoned off, and the battleship Aurora was already moored just beneath its windows. It certainly was not within the power of the Women's Battalion to deflect the blow, which was even now being aimed at the palace.
In years to come, communist propaganda would portray the storming of the palace as one of the most glorious moments in Russian history. The truth was otherwise.
The Winter Palace was not stormed. The number of people who took part in its capture were no more than a few hundred. Some people say this shows that it was a military coup. Others still insist that the lack of support doesn't negate the fact that it was a popular revolution. Perhaps the way to look at this is the fact that there was mass apathy. Nobody wanted to come out and fight for either side.
Many in the mob that broke through the palace gates were more interested in the contents of the cellar than in revolution.
Because when they took the Winter Palace, they found in its basement the largest wine cellar ever known to history. There was the supply of the Tsar's favorite wine, his Chateau d'Yquem 1847, the grandest of the Grand Vin. And the looting mob that had taken the Winter Palace immediately began ransacking these cellars. The Bolsheviks didn't know how to control the situation. They tried to brick up the cellars with a wall, but the mob simply knocked it down. They tried to pump the wine out of the cellar basement and into the Neva, but they found crowds assembling around the drains, drinking the booze.
The drunken mob was an omen of the difficulties the Bolsheviks faced in gaining control of Russia. Ending the war was the first step. In December of 1917, they signed an armistice with the Germans. 3 months later, they learned the price. In the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia lost over 1 million square miles of land and 62 million people. If France and Britain had any doubts about what a German victory would mean, they had only to look at Russia. But that was not Lenin's worry. He would spend the next 3 years fighting a bitter civil war, one which would claim the lives of millions, including the Tsar and his family. Lenin's rival, Alexander Kerensky, escaped to the United States where he lectured and wrote. In later years, he voiced the regret that he had not died when the revolution was young. Sergei Mstislavsky became a novelist. A survivor, he outlasted war, revolution, civil war, and Joseph Stalin's purges. Yashka, who had become identified with Kerensky, was not so fortunate. She made her way to New York, where she dictated her remarkable memoirs. But in 1920, she returned to Russia and was shot by the Bolsheviks.
The tide was too mighty. It had swamped all that was good and noble in Russia. Russia herself seemed wrecked forever in that maelstrom of unbridled passions.
"1917 had been a year of mutiny and revolution. Forces that would dominate the last year of the war and the rest of the 20th century.